Hey guys, in this video, I'm gonna go over question 2 from Unit 6, okay? Admittedly, question 2 was a lot more involved than question 1, but after you get through all the reading, you'll realize that it's actually not that bad. And in this question, you were supposed to write two methods, okay? So we have this class called payroll, okay? So here's our class, payroll. And in payroll, we have two variables, right? So we have two fields, which are items sold, which is the number of items sold by each employee, and wages, which is the wage, well, we'll talk about that in a second. But I want you to notice a couple of things. I want you to notice that um, items sold and wages are both one-dimensional arrays. Okay, so they're both lists of items sold and wages. So it's not just one value. Okay, so that's very important because we're going to have to use that information when writing our two methods, which are compute bonus threshold, that's one method you have to write, and compute wages, which is another method you have to write. Now, there's a lot of reading going on here. I'm not going to read all of it because it would take too long, so I want you to read on your own and make sure you understand what this problem is asking, okay? Now, I just want to point out a couple of things. So, whenever they ask you to write a method, you should make sure you understand what is expected of that method. Okay, so let's focus on the first method they want us to write, which is a method called compute bonus threshold. Okay, so take a look at this method. It says public double compute bonus threshold, and there's nothing inside the parentheses. So what does this mean? This means that it doesn't take in any parameters, and it means that it returns a double value. So when you're writing this method, you have to make sure that it's returning a double value. Very important, okay? So you have to, before you even get into writing a method, just make sure you know what is expected of that method. Okay, so let's focus on bonus threshold, which is part A. Okay, what I like is the fact that they give us an example, which is awesome. Okay, so here is how the bonus threshold is calculated. So let me read. The bonus threshold is calculated based on the numbers of items sold by all employees on a given day. The employee with the greatest number of sales and the employee with the least number of sales on that day are ignored in the calculation. The average number of items sold by the remaining employees on that day is computed, and this value is used as the bonus threshold. So basically, items sold is an array of items sold numbers, right? And each element represents how many items some employee sold. So employee 0, let's say, sold 48. Employee 1 sold 50. Employee 2 sold 37. So basically, the main idea here is we need to take the average of these numbers. But there's one little thing, and it's basically the average without the biggest number and without the smallest number. That's it. So you're basically taking the average of this, but making sure you leave out the biggest number and the smallest number. So if you see in the example they did, they added all the numbers up minus the lowest number, which was 37 in this example, and the biggest number, which was 70 in this example. And even though we have 10 numbers here, right? Because we're taking the average and we're leaving out two numbers, they had to divide by 8. Now, the length of items sold doesn't have to be 10, so just be careful, okay? So we actually have to take our length and subtract it by 2 when we divide, okay? And then we'll return that average as a double value. Okay, so let me show you what I did. So again, I have the class written out and stuff, and I even have the fields. I even have my items sold array, but I just did that so I could test this out, but you don't have to do all that. What they ask you to do is just the method to calculate the bonus threshold. So here's my method. Public double compute bonus threshold. They gave me that, okay? So I'm using the same exact syntax. Now, here's what we have to do. We have to iterate through this array, right? Go through every single element and figure out what the maximum value is and what the minimum value is. That's the first thing we have to do. And then we have to add up everything and subtract the maximum value and the minimum value to get this top number right here. So here's what I did. I assumed that the maximum number is the first element in my array. So items sold is my array, right? Here's my array. So max equals, and it's an integer, right? So int max equals the first element at index 0. Just assigning my maximum to the first number and assigning my minimum to the first element. Okay, so that's a trick we're pretty familiar with. I'm also keeping track of the total by just saying my total is 0 right now. I haven't added anything up. And that's also an integer value. Okay, so here I use an enhanced for loop. Just if you're not sure what an enhanced for loop, go back and watch the video on question number 1 from Unit 6. Okay, so for every element in items sold, if I go through so I'm going through each element in this array, okay? And if my maximum number, which right now I'm starting with, I'm saying 48 is my max in this example, right? If I find that this element is bigger than my max, well, now my max is that element. So basically, I'm going through every element in my array and comparing it to my max value. And if I find something bigger than my max value, then that element becomes my max value. Okay? Again, this is a trick you guys should be familiar with by now. I do the same thing for minimum, but minimum is the reverse. So I assume the first element is my minimum, and if I find something smaller, so if an element is smaller than my minimum, then that means that element is my new minimum. So that's a good trick to give me both my maximum and my minimum. And I just use 2 separate if conditionals to do that. Okay, so now I should have my max and I should have my min. Okay, so let's see. And so what I did here is that every time I iterated through an element, so outside any of my conditions, what I did is I just updated my total. So my total right now is basically all of these numbers, right? But remember, we don't want that. This is a specific example where we have to subtract the biggest number and the smallest number. So after I find my total, all I did is I took my total and subtracted my max and subtracted my min, right? And so now I kept it all in a variable called total. I guess I could have done a variable called average. So I could have done this, double average. Okay, and then I could have done this. Average equals all of this. Okay, maybe that's better. And then I would return average. Okay, so let me explain that. Okay, so now I have to figure out my average, right? So I'm going to take my total, which is the total of all the elements. I'm going to subtract my max and subtract my min. So total minus max minus min. You could have also done this. Total minus max plus min, right? Same thing. Here's the example with real numbers. So here's their total, then they're subtracting the 37, and then they're subtracting the 70. Okay? So I'm just going to keep it how I had it. And then we have to divide by, oops, sorry guys, I just have an alarm. So then I have to divide by the number of items in my array. Again, don't assume that we have 10 items. Items sold can be any array of any length, right? So here's what I did. Now, average can be a decimal, right? And it probably will be a decimal. So now remember that these numbers are all integers. So in order to get a decimal answer, you have to typecast, either the numerator and denominator by double or one of them. Okay, so I decided to typecast my denominator. So I'm making my denominator a double so that my average itself is a double. Okay, and so how do we find the length? Well, items sold dot length would give us the length, and length is a method, so you need the parentheses. But remember, we don't want the total length of the array because we're taking away the max and min, so we have to subtract 2. And then we're going to return the average. Okay? So that takes care of our first method. Again, because the way they gave us the method, it's public double, we have to make sure that when we return, first of all, we have to make sure that we return a double. So average is in fact a double. So I'm sure they would take points off if you didn't do that. Okay? And then we just need to make sure that we're not using any parameters because they told us not to, the way they gave us the syntax for compute bonus threshold. Okay, so that was the first method. The second method was computing wages. Okay, so let's go down to the second method. You know, I think what made this question so confusing is just how much writing they had. Because when I really looked at it and saw what we had to do, I was like, this is actually not that hard. It's just figuring out what they wanted from you was kind of confusing. Okay, so here's what we have to do for compute bonus threshold. So first, let's look at this method. So this method is interesting. It's public void, so it's not returning anything, okay? And it's called compute wages. And it takes on 2 parameters, a value called fixed wage and a value called per item wage. So we're going to need to use these in our method. Okay, so what I did to understand this method is I just kind of used their example. Okay, so it says suppose that fixed wage is 10 and per item wage is 1.5. So these are numbers that will be passed on to our method right here. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so employee 0, so they're looking at the items sold array, which is a field, right? So employee 0 did not sell more items than the bonus threshold. So remember, the bonus threshold is calculated using this method. So that's how we would know what the bonus threshold is. So basically, we're going to take each item in items sold and compare it to our bonus threshold. So in this specific array, the bonus threshold was 51.75. So 48 is not, it doesn't make the threshold, right? 50 doesn't make the threshold. 37 doesn't. 62 does, right? So okay, so for any employee that doesn't make the bonus threshold, this is how they're calculating their wages. So it says for employee 0, their wages are, they're just doing the fixed wage, which is 10, plus they're taking the 1.5, which is the per item wage, and multiplying it by how many items they sold. So 10 plus, and then 1.5 times 48. That's pretty easy, right? It's just a formula. It's the fixed wage plus per item wage, which is 1.5 in this case, and then you multiply it by this element, how many items they sold. Okay, now there's it's a different calculation if the employee did make the threshold. So for employee 9, for example, 60, that's beyond the threshold of 51.75, right? So then there's a different way to calculate their wages. They're going to get a bonus. So their wages are equal to, so it starts with the same calculation. It's the 10 plus the 1.5 times how many items they sold. So 10 plus 1.5 times 60. But then they get a 10% bonus. So they're taking this whole calculation, and in order to get 10% added on, you do 1.1 times 1.1. Okay? So this is actually very useful because they're basically giving you the math. You don't really have to know a lot of math. You don't have to know that adding on 10% is the same thing as multiplying by 1.1. They're basically telling you the math. Okay, so now you have to figure out how to do this. By the way, let's read what it says. Write the method compute wages. Assume the item sold has been filled appropriately and there are at least 3 employees in the array. Assume also that the wages array and the items sold array have the same length. Okay? So basically, guys, here's what I want to show you something. Okay? So here's items sold, right? So basically they're saying that wages is also another array. That's the same length. So if there's 10 items sold, then if there's 10 employees that sold items, right, then their wages are also in an array. So basically, this person who sold 48 items, his wages were how much? 82, right? So basically, what I'm trying to say is that the wages array represents the wages for that employee. So the person who sold 48, he made $82, okay? And the person who sold 60 made 110 in wages. Okay, so that's what they're basically saying. We have to fill in the wages array based on the items sold and the calculations they gave us. So that's what we have to do. That's why this is a void method. It's not going to return anything. It's just going to fill in the wages array. Okay, so going back to the answer. So here is one way to do this. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is we have to iterate through the items sold and we have to check who made the threshold and who didn't. So for each element, we have to check if that element is greater than the threshold. Okay, so here's what I did. First, I have a for loop, not an enhanced. I used a regular. You could have used an enhanced, but I just used a regular for loop. So for int I equals 0, I is less than item sold dot length, I plus plus. Okay, I'm not going to go over that, just a regular for loop. Then I calculated the threshold. So I did this variable, oh, I should say, let's see, it's a double, right? So double threshold. Yeah. Double threshold equals compute bonus thresholds. Remember, this returns a value, and I'm taking that value and saving it in a double called threshold. So now the calculations for their wages, there's 2 ways to calculate the wages, depending on if they made the threshold or not. So if items sold I, meaning the element at I, is less than or equal to the threshold, then their wages, then that corresponding element in wages is going to be equal to the fixed wage, which comes from here, plus the per item wage times how many items they sold, right? So items sold I, okay? So that's it, because this calculation right here is if they didn't make the threshold. And if they didn't make the threshold, oops, let me go back here. It's just the fixed wage. Here the example was 10, but we don't know what the fixed wage is. It's just a variable. Plus the per item wage times that element in items sold. So that's what I did here. That's this. Okay? And then the other option is if the item sold was beyond the threshold, greater than the threshold. So then if that's the case, it's this calculation right here, right? It's this calculation, fixed wage plus per item wage times item sold I. But then you're giving them a 10% bonus, which I think they said that the 10%, yeah, the 10% bonus is just always 10%. It's a constant, so it's 1.1. Okay, that's it. Those are the 2 methods you needed for this problem. Okay, so hopefully this video was helpful. I know I went a little bit fast, but you can pause and rewind and things like that. But I wanted to help you out because we haven't had a chance to do free response questions, and in my opinion, free response questions are harder than coding from scratch because you're bound by what they want and you're bound by their design of the program. So it takes a different kind of thinking to understand how to do a free response question, okay? Let me know if this video was helpful. You can leave some comments in Google Classroom or send me a private email. But hopefully you are watching these videos and using them to your advantage. All right?